There is a well meaning cliche that's been making its rounds for a few years that, if used today in our current moment, can lead to a lot of pain. The cliche is don't just survive, thrive. And I know this is a well meaning cliche. No one wants to go through life and look back and realize that they did just enough to get by, that they were doing the bare minimum to just make it from one day to the next, right? We want to live life fully. Unfortunately, though, if this is used in the wrong time, it can lead to abuse and pain and real feelings of shame to people because there are times when all we can do is to survive. Right? And I'm sure that's how some of us feel right now, that we're doing the best we can to survive, the best we can to be parents of some level, to keep our marriages are just surviving, that our jobs are just surviving, that financially we're just surviving. And I just want to take a moment to encourage you that it's okay to just survive. And more than that, sometimes it becomes even more than okay to just survive. That often surviving for a season leads to an opportunity to thrive later on. There's a great biblical story that highlights this, as well as a great study in the worlds of psychiatry and psychology that reaffirm this truth as well. The psychiatrist is J.T. McCurdy, and I ran across his work in the book by Malcolm Gladwell of David and Goliath, which is an excellent book. And McCurdy studied the effects of the London Blitz, the bombing of London by Nazi Germany during World War II. As many of you know, this was when Nazi Germany turned their eyes to London. Their main mode of attack was to bomb the major cities, particularly London. And the anticipation of these bombings led to high anxiety for the political and military leaders in England. Of course, they were worried about fatalities and they were worried about buildings being destroyed, but they were particularly worried about the panic that would result from all the bombings. They assumed that people would just hunker down at home or they would flee the city, that they wouldn't go to work in the factories producing the materials that they needed to actually fight the war. They even built psychiatric hospitals on the outskirts of London, thinking that there would be people who would be so disturbed over the bombings that mentally they would have a break and wouldn't be able to take it and would need these psychiatric hospitals from the bombings. Well, the bombings came starting with 57 consecutive nights of bombings and lasting for over a period of 8 months. Germany dropped tens of thousands of pounds of bombs and many these like fire-inducing devices as well. And all told, over 40,000 people died, 46,000 people were injured, and over 1 million buildings were damaged or destroyed. But the panic never came. Those psychiatric hospitals on the outskirts of town never got used. They were actually eventually converted to military use. And so the question is, why did this happen? Why did this panic not come? So the psychiatrist McCurdy, he examines the people and he realizes that the bombs divided people into 3 categories. The first category were the direct hits. Right, these are people who sadly were hit and killed by a bombing. And McCurdy notes that while this is tragic, the death of a person doesn't induce panic in others. It may affect them or hurt them if it's a loved one, but it doesn't induce panic. And that leads to the second group. The second group are those who are the near miss. Now, the near miss people are somebody who lost a loved one from a bomb, or they were hurt in some capacity. Maybe they lost their home, or maybe they lost were maimed in some way, or were concussed. These people were really affected. And that leads to the third group. which is this group that McCurdy calls remote miss. And these make up the majority of the people. These are people who heard the bomb sirens, heard the planes, heard the bombs drop, and the bombs go off, and then they came out of the situation unscarred. And McCurdy noticed that the more and more bombs that people experienced like this, the more courageous they felt, the more they started to realize that they were enduring this painful and scary reality, but they were kept coming out of it unscarred, that these people started to become courageous instead of fearful. Now, Gladwell, what he does is he builds off McCurdy's findings, and he combines it with some other interesting research where he sees that a disproportionate number of geniuses, of presidents of the United States, of prime ministers in the United Kingdom, that a disproportionate number of them had lost a parent at an early age. Now, I think we would all agree that to lose a parent is a near miss, that you suffer a real loss, that's going to deeply affect and hurt you in a significant way. But Gladwell noticed that many of these people, that over time, that as they survived the near miss, that it got transformed from a near miss to a remote miss. That these people started to realize that they had suffered this terrible thing, but they weren't destroyed. They didn't die. And when you have that realization, it gives you courage. I mean, if you think about it, if you lost a parent in your childhood, how anxious would you feel about failing as an entrepreneur? Right? It doesn't compare. Like, failing at business is nothing compared to losing a parent. How anxious would you feel about receiving rejection from a potential date? Right? If you've gone through the pain of actually losing a parent or losing a loved one, it doesn't compare. And so this shows us that there are some seasons of life where just surviving is actually to advance in life. I'm missing one of my favorite spring traditions, which is watching my favorite college basketball team, the University of Kansas, compete in the end-of-the-year tournament. And a common cliche of that tournament is all you need to do, all you want to do, is survive and advance. Because it doesn't matter if you beat your opponent by 1 point or 50 points. All you're trying to do is live to play another day. And that is true with many seasons of life, that to survive is to advance, that to survive today builds or creates the foundation to thrive tomorrow. The biblical story of this is the one of Joseph. Joseph is one of 12 brothers, and he is disliked by most of his brothers, mainly because he is his father's favorite. So one day, his brothers get the idea to sell him as a slave. And so they sell him as a slave, and they go to their father, and they lie to their father, and they say that Joseph has been eaten by a wild animal. And Joseph, as a slave, he's not doing much thriving, right? You can't really thrive as a slave. He's just surviving. He's just doing his work. But then things get worse. The wife's owner makes a move on Joseph. And Joseph turns her down. And the wife, what she does then is she goes to her husband and lies to her husband and says that Joseph is the one that had made a move on her, had assaulted her. And so Joseph is now thrown in jail. And again, there's not a lot of thriving that one does in jail. So Joseph just does his duty in jail. And through the providence of God, he interprets a dream of the king of Egypt, and the king of Egypt then puts him in charge of the whole Egyptian kingdom during this terrible famine that they're about to experience. And when this famine comes, eventually Joseph's brothers have to come to Egypt because they need to buy food. And when Joseph encounters his brothers are afraid of him, because these are the same brothers who sold them into slavery, that led him to being falsely accused of assaulting a woman, that led him to be thrown in jail. And Joseph has every right to pay them back. But instead, Joseph says this to his brothers. He says to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. This season right now may be intending to harm you, but God can use it for good. And we know that God can use it for good because we know what God has done for us in Jesus. How in Jesus God has transformed the cross from being the symbol of oppression and cruelty and death to a symbol of hope, because Jesus took on sin and death and evil in his body and put it to death in the cross, and then rose from the grave as the victor over sin and death. And my hope for you is that you would find life in his life during these times of death and suffering and sadness.